There are moments in politics that most people barely notice because they do not resemble power. They are quiet. They are not dramatic. They do not arrive wrapped in flags, slogans, or warnings. They do not present themselves as history in the making. And yet, when you pause and really observe them, they often reveal more about where a country is heading than any staged announcement ever could. What I want to focus on today is one of those moments. You may have seen the clip, you may have scrolled past it without much thought. A prime minister standing near a fire, smiling with children, passing out marshmallows, joking about sugar highs and singed eyebrows. No podium, no performance, no visible choreography. Just a person standing outside in the cold with families. On the surface, it looks insignificant. A seasonal video, a feel-good holiday scene. But if that is all you see, you are missing what is actually unfolding, because politics is not only shaped by what leaders say, it is shaped by how they occupy power. It is shaped by whether power feels threatening or calming when it enters a shared space. And in this quiet moment, standing by a campfire, Mark Carney communicated something without ever needing to explain it. Leadership today is usually expressed through distance, layers of assistance, layers of messaging, carefully curated images that feel more like products than people. Citizens are talked at, analyzed, categorized, persuaded, managed. They are rarely met as they are. And when leaders try to appear relatable, it often feels rehearsed, stiff, or transactional. People are quick to sense when warmth is being deployed as a tactic rather than lived as a pattern. What stood out to many Canadians was not that a prime minister showed up. It was the manner in which he showed up. No visible attempt to command the space, no effort to make himself the focal point. He was not there to be admired. He was there to take part, laughing with kids, checking that people were comfortable, kneeling to their level, offering time without asking for anything back. That detail carries more weight than it may seem, especially after years marked by political tension, economic strain, and constant emotional fatigue. Now, place that image against the wider global context we are living in. Across much of the world, politics has become louder, harsher, and more draining. Power is often displayed through intimidation, humiliation, and spectacle. Strength is mistaken for noise. Authority is confused with aggression. Few figures embody that style more clearly than Donald Trump, whose approach relies on conflict, grievance, and dominance. When that style enters a room, people brace themselves. When it shapes relationships between countries, allies grow cautious and defensive. This is where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. One leader builds trust through presence. Another demands allegiance through fear. One lowers the emotional temperature. The other raises it. People register that difference instinctively, even when they struggle to describe it in policy language. Humans are highly sensitive to emotional cues from those in authority. We recognize when someone is grounded. We recognize when someone is performing power rather than carrying responsibility. From an economic and social standpoint, this distinction matters deeply. Trust is not a soft concept. It is a form of infrastructure. Communities with higher trust cooperate more effectively, adapt more easily, and absorb shocks with greater resilience. Leaders who reduce fear create room for collaboration, problem solving, and long-term thinking. Leaders who amplify fear compress the horizon, forcing everyone into short-term defensive behavior. When people react so strongly to a simple campfire scene, they are not reacting to marshmallows. They are reacting to relief. Relief that power can still appear human. Relief that leadership does not have to feel like an emotional tax. Relief that someone at the top does not need to dominate every interaction to feel legitimate. That relief represents a different kind of political capital, one that cannot be easily manufactured. This is why the image matters even though no policy was announced. It signals something about how power may be exercised when decisions do arrive, whether people will be heard, whether dignity will be protected, whether disagreement will be met with respect or with punishment. These are not abstract concerns. They shape labor relations, public trust, and international diplomacy. So when you see a leader standing alongside families rather than towering over them, do not dismiss it as optics. Ask what kind of political culture that behavior reinforces. Ask how it makes people feel about their place in the system. Ask why such a modest act feels rare enough to stand out at all. That is the deeper story taking shape here. And it tells us something important about the kind of leadership people are craving right now, whether they consciously recognize it or not. What is especially revealing is how quickly people connected that small, quiet moment to much larger judgments about character. The reactions made that clear. People were not debating strategy or ideology. They were talking about sincerity. They were talking about kindness. They were asking whether a smile felt genuine. In an era defined by deep political cynicism, that is not trivial. It shows how deprived people have become of authenticity in positions of power. When someone says it is refreshing to see a normal human being as prime minister, that is not a casual remark. It is a diagnosis of how unnatural leadership has begun to feel. Consider what that statement really implies. It suggests that for years people have been asked to accept leaders who feel distant, performative, or transactional. Leaders who speak in abstractions while everyday life grows more fragile. Leaders who appear only to announce, defend, or sell something. Over time, that produces emotional distance. People stop feeling represented not only politically, but personally. They stop believing that those in charge understand what ordinary life under economic pressure actually feels like. So when someone watches a leader laugh easily, joke about burned eyebrows, and hand out marshmallows without urgency or calculation, it breaks through that distance. It signals comfort without entitlement, confidence without arrogance. It suggests someone who does not need to constantly assert importance. That kind of ease is uncommon in systems that reward dominance and relentless self-promotion. There is another layer that many people noticed as well. It was not only how Carney interacted with children, but how he treated other adults around him, with attention, with respect, without condescension. That matters because it reflects how power flows downward and sideways, not just upward. People instinctively connect that behavior to how leaders treat workers, civil servants, allies, and critics. This is why references to his interactions with figures like Vladimir Zelensky resonate. People are not separating personal demeanor from foreign policy, they are linking them. They are recognizing the same qualities across contexts: calm, respect, emotional intelligence, a refusal to turn every interaction into a contest of dominance. In a world increasingly shaped by geopolitical tension, that approach stands out. From an economic systems perspective, this is not superficial. International cooperation relies heavily on trust, predictability, and mutual respect. Markets respond not only to rates and tariffs, but to perceptions of stability and leadership maturity. When a country is led by someone who appears grounded and emotionally regulated, perceived risk declines. Investors, allies, and institutions absorb those signals, whether they openly acknowledge it or not. Now, place this moment beside the other leadership model that has dominated headlines for years, a model driven by constant escalation, one that frames politics as endless combat, one that treats insult and threat as bargaining tools. That style can energize a loyal base, but over time it eats away at institutions. It drains the public. It turns governance into theater and relationships into zero-sum contests. Most importantly, it makes cooperation harder at the exact moment when complex global problems demand it most. When people say that Carney feels new to politics, they are not reacting to inexperience. They are reacting to contrast, a contrast in tone, a contrast in emotional stance, a contrast in what seems to matter to him. He does not appear to feed off humiliation or conflict. He does not seem to require an enemy in every space. And that absence of constant antagonism creates room for others to breathe. That is why words like respect and even reverence show up in responses, not because people have abandoned skepticism, but because they recognize something rarely reflected back at them by power. They recognize steadiness. And in uncertain times, steadiness pulls people in. This is not about turning a person into a symbol. It is about understanding what kind of leadership culture people are gravitating toward after years of volatility and strain. When economic anxiety is high, when global systems feel fragile, when institutions feel worn down, people search for leaders who do not add to the chaos. They look for those who lower the emotional noise so real problems can be addressed. That is what this moment quietly communicated. Not a promise, not a policy, a posture, a way of holding power that does not constantly remind everyone who is in charge, but instead reassures them that someone capable and grounded is carrying the responsibility. Now go one layer deeper, because moments like this do not exist in isolation. They sit inside a broader political and economic system that has trained us to expect something very different from leaders. For decades, especially under modern capitalism, leadership has been rewarded not for care, but for performance, not for listening, but for projecting certainty, not for humility, but for dominance. Executives, politicians, and public figures are taught that vulnerability looks weak, that warmth looks unserious, and that authority must always be asserted rather than shared. This is not random, it is structural. Our economic system elevates people who can distance themselves from the human impact of their decisions. It rewards fluency in metrics while lived experience fades into the background. That mindset travels easily from boardrooms into government. You see it when leaders talk confidently about growth while communities empty out. You see it when austerity is framed as necessity instead of choice. You see it when ordinary people are reduced to variables rather than lives. Against that backdrop, a leader who does not rush to separate himself from everyday human interaction feels disruptive, even if he is doing nothing overtly political. Standing at a campfire without hierarchy is not radical on its own. What is radical is how rare it has become. And that rarity tells us something uncomfortable about the system we are operating within. People are not responding because Carney handed out marshmallows. They are responding because he did not seem uncomfortable with closeness. He did not appear uneasy without control. He did not try to convert the moment into branding. In economic terms, what people are reacting to is the absence of extraction. He was not extracting attention, obedience, or symbolic loyalty. He was simply there. Compare that to how power is usually exercised. Most public appearances are transactional. They are designed to generate approval, deflect criticism, or signal strength. Even kindness, when it shows up, often feels calculated, and people notice. Humans are remarkably good at sensing when they are being managed instead of met. This is where the comparison with Trump goes beyond style. His leadership approach reflects an extreme version of hyper-competitive market logic. Everything becomes about winning or losing. Relationships matter only if they produce leverage. Respect is demanded, not built. Emotion is used as a weapon rather than shared as a signal. That approach shapes more than rhetoric. It shapes institutions. It leads to unstable policy, volatile diplomacy, and economic uncertainty. The costs are spread across society. Workers experience whiplash from abrupt policy shifts. Businesses operate under shifting rules. Allies hedge instead of committing. Communities live with constant background tension. Over time, that tension becomes normal even as it erodes trust. What you are seeing in the response to Carney is a collective exhale. People are reacting to the idea that leadership might not have to hurt all the time. That authority might coexist with gentleness. That intelligence does not need to announce itself through aggression. Those realizations are not small. They reshape what people think is possible. Economists often talk about confidence as a driver of growth, but they rarely talk about emotional confidence. The confidence that comes from knowing you will not be humiliated to make a point. The confidence that comes from feeling noticed rather than threatened. The confidence that comes from power that does not constantly need to prove itself. That kind of confidence changes how people interact with institutions. It affects whether they engage, cooperate, comply, or withdraw. And this is where media framing repeatedly falls short. Conflict is easy to package. It turns politics into personality clashes. It centers outrage, scandal, and spectacle. What it rarely examines is emotional governance, how leaders shape the emotional climate of a society, how they normalize fear or trust. A quiet moment by a fire does not fit neatly into that frame. There is no outrage hook, no breaking banner, and yet it may reveal more about a country's trajectory than a dozen shouting matches ever could. Systems are held together not only by laws and budgets, but by shared emotional expectations. When people feel respected, they are more willing to accept sacrifice. When they feel seen, they are more open to complexity. When they feel constantly belittled or threatened, they retreat into defensiveness and resentment. Those emotional patterns feed directly into economic outcomes, political polarization, and social cohesion. So when you see this reaction forming, do not dismiss it as sentimentality. It is structural feedback. It is society signaling what kind of leadership environment it finds livable. It is also quietly rejecting a model that has left too many people exhausted, anxious, and disconnected from those who claim to govern in their name. That is why this moment matters, not because it fixes anything on its own, but because it shows what people are ready to move away from and what they are ready to move toward. Now bring this down to the level of everyday life, because this is where abstractions either land or disappear. When leadership relies on fear and constant confrontation, that emotional climate does not stay in politics. It spills into workplaces, schools, and communities. Managers feel licensed to rule through pressure rather than respect. Institutions grow rigid instead of responsive. People begin to expect conflict instead of cooperation. They carry that expectation everywhere. You feel it at work when decisions arrive without explanation. You feel it when schedules change suddenly and you are told to adapt without question. You feel it when economic insecurity is treated as a personal failure instead of a structural condition. Over time, people absorb the message that power is something to endure, not something that serves them. That belief has consequences. Civic engagement drops, burnout rises, people's sense of agency shrinks. This is why emotional tone at the top matters more than we are usually taught to believe. A leader who models calm, respect, and attention is not just being polite. They are setting expectations for how authority can function across the system. They are signaling that listening is not weakness, that dignity is not a concession, that people are not problems to manage, but participants in a shared effort. When people watch a prime minister kneel to speak to a child at eye level, they are not just reacting emotionally. They are quietly recalibrating what they think power is allowed to look like. That recalibration matters when those same people interact with bosses, teachers, officials, and even each other. It nudges behavior away from dominance and toward reciprocity. Now compare that with a leadership style built on humiliation, dismissal, and framing disagreement as betrayal. That style teaches people that cruelty equals competence, that volume equals authority, that being heard requires overpowering others. Economically, that environment corrodes trust. Transaction costs rise. Everything requires enforcement, monitoring, and punishment. Cooperation becomes fragile. Long-term planning becomes harder because no one knows what will be destabilized next. This is not about personality. It is about governance style as an economic factor. Systems built on trust outperform those built on fear over time. They innovate better. They absorb shocks more smoothly. They waste less energy on internal conflict. And they allow people to imagine a future that does not feel constantly under threat. What makes this moment resonate so strongly is its timing. Many Canadians are already stretched thin. Housing remains expensive. Work feels less secure. Global tensions feel closer than before. In that environment, people are not only weighing policies, they are judging whether those in power understand what that strain feels like, whether they carry it carefully or add to it. A leader who appears emotionally regulated sends a powerful signal. I am steady, so you do not have to panic. That signal lowers stress in ways no slogan ever could. It does not remove problems, but it changes how people meet them. It creates space for patience, for conversation, for steady progress instead of permanent emergency. This is also why the contrast with Trump's leadership style is so sharp on the international stage. Allies do not only measure tariffs and treaties, they measure temperament. They wonder whether commitments will last, whether insults will appear without warning, whether cooperation will be met with respect or retaliation. When those doubts linger, trust weakens and collective action loses strength. In a world already struggling with climate instability, fragile supply chains, and rising geopolitical risk, leadership that heightens tension is not just unpleasant, it is risky. It turns difficult problems into nearly unsolvable ones. Leadership that lowers the emotional temperature does the opposite. It opens room for coordination, realism, and shared problem solving. So when people react so strongly to something that appears simple, understand that simplicity itself has become rare. A leader acting human without spectacle feels unusual because the system has trained us to expect performance instead. That sense of novelty is not a distraction from serious governance. It is a condition for it. This is where the larger lesson comes into view. Politics is not only about who holds authority, it is about how authority feels as it moves through everyday life. It is about whether people experience power as a threat or as a shared responsibility. That campfire moment mattered because it quietly answered that question in a way many had stopped expecting. What we are seeing is not the success of clever optics. It is the exposure of how deeply people want leadership that does not drain them emotionally. That desire is not sentimental, it is practical. It is a reaction to years of pressure under systems that mistake harshness for strength and conflict for effectiveness. As this leadership style continues to unfold, the real question is not whether moments like this are charming. The real question is whether they point to a lasting commitment to governing with empathy, steadiness, and respect. If they do, the consequences reach far beyond a cold evening and a few marshmallows. And that leads to the question the media almost never asks. Not whether a leader is likable, but what kind of system rewards or punishes this kind of leadership over time. It is one thing to appreciate warmth in a single scene. It is another to ask whether our political and economic structures allow that warmth to survive once pressure intensifies. History suggests caution. Systems built on constant competition, short-term targets, and endless crisis tend to wear down even those who start with good intentions. They reward people who harden, who oversimplify, who divide rather than connect. Whether this moment becomes meaningful depends less on personality and more on whether the system itself is capable of supporting a different way of holding power.